Hello again. Today I'm going to do a sort of a compare-contrast of our three most important composers of the classical era, which are, of course, in chronological order, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Each of these three has a brief biographical section in Part 4 of the textbook. The one for Hyden, it begins at the bottom of page 177. The one for Mozart begins a few pages later, 182 and 183. Of course, this is if you have the 9th brief edition. If you have a different edition, they're probably very close to those page numbers. And of course, here for Beethoven, pages 197 through 198. So I'm not going to go over all the stuff that is already in those biographical sections. But what I'm going to do is kind of compare and contrast them and also talk about how their careers differed and how this kind of ties into some other stuff in this chapter which you might want to review. And that is this section on the composer, patron, and public in the classical period. So this is the section beginning page 163. So I would reread that section first on the composer, the public, and the patron, 163, 164, and then go through and read each of those different biographical sections. Maybe take some notes as you're reading. One thing I will, since I'm here on page 164, one thing I'm going to make note of is they have an entire couple of paragraphs about the city of Vienna, which was sort of like the unofficial musical capital of Europe at this time. So first thing I want to make sure that we understand Vienna as distinct from Venice, because Venice was a very important city back in the Baroque era, still an important city during this time. But as far as music goes, Vienna is really the where things are happening. Really by virtue of the fact that all three of these great classical composers, and many others actually, but the three greatest, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, all lived and worked in Vienna for at least some part of their professional lives. And in the case of Beethoven, it was really basically his entire adult life. Venice, of course, that's in Italy. Vienna is in Austria. Today it's the capital of the nation of Austria, but back then it was the capital of something called the Holy Roman Empire, which you may dimly recall from your high school social studies classes or something. The Holy Roman Empire, or sometimes just called the Empire or the German Empire, was an empire loosely speaking, I guess. The old joke is that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. What it was kind of a confederation, more or less, of German-speaking states. And by states, I mean some of them were kingdoms, some of them were basically city-states. So there were about over 200, maybe 250 of these German-speaking states, which technically the emperor in Vienna was sovereign technically over this area. In practice, the individual rulers of these states had more or less power, autonomy, depending on often on their size, their strength, their distance from Vienna. But what's interesting about Vienna is that it's kind of it's at a crossroads, literally and culturally, in Europe. Being in Central Europe, you've got Italy just to the south and over the Alps. You've got France not too far over to the west. You've got Eastern Europe to the east, and a lot of interesting musical influences coming from, for example, Poland, or what is today called the Czech Republic, what was then called Bohemia. And then, of course, you've got Germany to the north. So Vienna was a very cosmopolitan city, a city where lots of different cultural paths crossed each other, and lots of different influences, lots of cross currents, lots of different languages spoken in the capital, Vienna. Vienna was I believe about the fourth largest city in Europe at the time, had about 250,000 people, which was very, very large for the time. Cities were much smaller in the 18th century and early 19th century than they later became. Vienna was and still is a music crazy city. People just loved music there, not only going to concerts, but also playing music at home themselves. People said when you walk down the street in Vienna, you could hear people practicing the piano, practicing the violin, playing little house concerts just through the windows. So all three of our classical masters worked here, lived and worked here. Haydn, very early in his career, and then later in his career, but in the middle, didn't get to visit Vienna as often as he would have liked. Mozart, as we will see, spent the last 10 years of his life essentially settled in Vienna, trying to make a go of it as a sort of a freelance composer, unfortunately not very successfully, at least from a financial point of view. And then Beethoven, being born in Germany, moved to Vienna when he was about 20 years old with the intention originally of studying with Mozart, becoming a pupil of Mozart. Unfortunately, by the time Beethoven relocated to Vienna, Mozart had died, and so he actually studied with Hyden for a while, and then started sort of establishing himself on his own as a pianist and later as a composer as well, and as a conductor. So all three of these composers lived and worked for quite a bit of their lives in Vienna, and for that reason they are sometimes referred to as the Viennese school of composers. Now, doesn't mean that they went to a school in Vienna. When we talk about a school in this sense, the Viennese school, we're talking about composers who are living in a certain place, in this case Vienna, and are there at around the same time and are working in a similar style. So that's what's meant by the Viennese school of composers, those three in particular. Okay, let's talk about these three in correct chronological order, starting with Haydn. So Haydn was born in 1732, which, just for frame of reference sake, it happens to be the same year that George Washington was born. So he is the oldest by quite a bit of our three classical composers. And unlike the other two, unlike Mozart and Beethoven, Haydn was not born into a family of professional musicians. Haydn's family was a guy who made wagon wheels, was a craftsman, a wheelwright, and lived in a little rural village where apparently he had 12 children, 12 mouths to feed. And so he sent actually several of his children off to Vienna to they sort of had an agreement, a deal, whereby his sons, first the eldest son, Franz Joseph Haydn, but then also a couple of younger brothers, Michael Haydn, who actually wound up being a very important composer of this period as well. They were sent to Vienna to sing in the choir of St. Stephen's Cathedral, and in exchange for their service singing in the choir, they were given an education, they were given room and board. Right? The choir, by the way, of St. Stephen's Cathedral, that's the big Catholic cathedral in the middle of Vienna. It's still there to this day, and that choir that Haydn sang in is today known as the Vienna Boys Choir, and they're quite famous. You can go to concerts, they tour all over the world, they put out CDs. This is the same choir that Haydn sang in as a boy. Remember, especially in traditionally Catholic countries like Vienna, women were not supposed to sing in church, and so you need prepubescent boys to sing the high parts, right? But this means that often when these boys, when their voices changed, they were just kind of dismissed, sent on their way. Thanks for your service. Have a nice life. Goodbye. And that's exactly what happened to Hyden when he was 16 years old. Now, Hyden did learn the basics of music, certainly, as a choir boy. He learned how to read and write music, and he learned the basics, and he was certainly exposed to a lot of excellent music, just being in that position and being in the most musical city in the world, Vienna. But when he was dismissed from service at age 16, he didn't really have formal training in composition. And he was not let's say, a virtuoso on any instrument. He was a good piano player, he was a good violin player, but he was not up to the level that he could go out and give concerts, really. Being from a poor family, he didn't really have very good prospects. So what he did for about almost 10 years, he kind of worked as a freelance, struggling, starving artist kind of musician in Vienna. So he played for weddings and funerals. He gave piano lessons. He even played as a street musician sometimes, just for tips. But during this time, he was also teaching himself composition. Haydn is more or less, or at least to a great extent, a self-taught composer. And the way that he taught himself was simply to copy out the works of other composers. And this was a common practice at the time. You would go to, let's say, a library, and you would check out works by certain composers, and then you would sit down with a piece of staff paper and just copy them out by hand. And in the act of copying them, you would learn the composer's style, and then you would also have your own copy of the music, so you could return the score that you borrowed to the library and have your own copy. So this is the kind of thing that Haydn did. And one particular composer that was a great influence on him was one of the sons of J.S. Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. Haydn mentioned specifically what a major influence C.P.E. Bach was on his own development, and you can hear it clearly in their music. Okay, so when he was in his late 20s, Haydn got his big break. He was given a job as a musician, as a court composer for the Esterházy family. The Esterházys were basically the richest family in Hungary. They owned like enormous plots of land, which they farmed and rented out, and they were just obscenely wealthy. And at the time they hired Haydn, they were actually in the process of building an enormous palace out in the countryside called Esterházy, and it's still there. And that's where Haydn spent most of the next 30 years or so as court composer. In this position, and this was a typical kind of position that, let's say, a Baroque era composer might have had. Haydn had a lot of responsibilities. He obviously had to compose music. He had to give lessons to members of the Esterházy family. He had to supervise the musicians under him. So the members of the orchestra were under his supervision, which means he was kind of responsible for their conduct even. He obviously had to put on performances of music, including operas. This palace had its own built-in opera house and its own built-in concert hall, apparently also a built-in marionette theater. And Haydn's position was essentially that of a high-class servant. He was on the staff. He was an employee. And he was treated like an employee. He was treated like the same way that the butler or the cook or the coach driver or whatever, okay, the gardener. He was a member of the household staff just like those others. Now, this means that Haydn didn't necessarily have as much creative independence as, let's say, later composers, as, let's say, Beethoven, who I'll get to in a few minutes. Haydn had to compose music to the satisfaction of his boss, this Hungarian prince. So he had to compose the kinds of pieces that his boss requested in the style that he knew his boss liked. And if he composed something that his boss didn't like, then he would probably hear about it. So he didn't have a lot of artistic independence necessarily. But Haydn seems not to have minded this at all. In fact, he considered himself fortunate to have this position. And when you think about the background that he came from, coming from a non-musical family, a working class, rural family, and to be working for this fabulously wealthy, noble family as their court composer, I mean, that's quite a lot of prestige. And over the years, in Haydn's service to this family, his reputation grew, so that by the time he retired from that position, when he was about 60 years old, by the time he retired, he was actually considered one of the greatest composers of the time. When he retired, he was given a pension, and he was given a house in Vienna, pretty nice deal, in recognition of his long years of service. And in his retirement, Haydn began kind of a second career, and this would have been around 1792 or so, when he was about 60 years old. He began this sort of second career as a freelance composer. Now, he was only really able to do this because he had paid his dues for 30 years. He was retired, again, he had a pension, and now he was kind of free to do whatever he wanted. And one of the things that he did, which is kind of a nice, kind of a highlight of his professional life, was that Haydn took 2 extended trips to England. This is the first time he'd ever been on a boat before, ever been off the European continent. He sailed across the English Channel in, I believe, 1791, the first time, and stayed for a year each time, 1791 to 92, and then again, I believe, from 95 to 96. I might be off a year or two of those dates. But he made 2 visits, each one a year long, because he was very, very popular in England. People loved his music. And while he was there, he put on performances of his works and kind of rubbed elbows with a lot of nobility and cultured English people. He received an honorary doctoral degree from Oxford University, so he was showered with honors and praise. His last 12 symphonies, by the way, including the one that we listened to the second movement of, if you recall, a few lectures ago, his last 12 symphonies were composed specifically for these visits to England, and that's why they're called the London Symphonies. Haydn also composed a couple of oratorios for performances in England, and you may recall that England also happened to be where Handel had spent the majority of his career, and Handel's oratorios were very, very popular in England. Haydn knew that the English people loved oratorios, and so he composed a couple of oratorios for performance there. A very nice, long, relatively long life and career for the time. Haydn died in 1809, and when he died, he was recognized as the grand old man of music. He would have been 77 years old. And it's a kind of interesting story, actually, but at the time that Haydn died, so this is back in Vienna, at the time that Haydn died, Napoleon was actually about to occupy the city of Vienna. And while Haydn was basically on his deathbed, Napoleon had his artillery around the city and was shelling the city and was beginning to send troops in. And someone mentioned to Napoleon that, the famous composer Hyden is there in Vienna, and they can't move him out. He's basically on his deathbed. And so Napoleon actually sent an honor guard of French troops to go stand guard outside Haydn's house, just to make sure that he would be safe, that no harm would come to him, which is kind of a nice gesture considering that Hyden was, an Austrian. He was kind of on the enemy side, but Napoleon recognized his greatness and wanted to make sure that Hyden was as comfortable as possible in his final moments. All right, Hyden composed all kinds of music, but he is probably best known for his symphonies and his string quartets. As I've mentioned before, he's considered the father of the symphony and the father of the string quartet, although he didn't invent either of those genres. He's not the first person to have composed a work with the title symphony, nor was he the first person to compose a string quartet, but he did more than anyone else to standardize the style, the norms, the practices of those two genres. He also composed quite a bit of piano music, solo piano music and chamber music with piano. He composed many, many operas. His operas aren't performed much today, though. In opera, he's really quite overshadowed by Mozart, who we'll talk about next. Okay, so talking about Haydn makes kind of an ideal contrast to talking about Mozart, who, chronologically speaking, is the next of our three great composers. So, because just about anything that you can say about Haydn, oftentimes the opposite was true of Mozart. So Mozart was born into a musical family. His father, Leopold, was a court composer working for an archbishop who was also a prince, who ruled over the city of Salzburg. So Mozart's father was on the staff, again, a court composer, and Mozart's father also, by the way, an excellent violinist who actually wrote a textbook on violin playing that was published the same year that his son was born, 1756. So Mozart was born into kind of an ideal situation. Of course, he was, as we know, he was a genius. He was maybe the most fantastic child prodigy in music history, but he also had luck in that he was born into a family of musicians. So there's another difference. Mozart was a phenomenal child prodigy from an early age, the way that Haydn was not. You may have heard some of these tales about Mozart, and it is true that even, by the time he was 6 or 7 years old, he was probably among the best piano players in Europe. He could sight read anything. He had a photographic musical memory. He had already, by the time he was 8 years old, had started to compose symphonies, composed an opera at age 12. From about age 6, I believe, until about age 15, Mozart was continuously on tour throughout Europe with his father. So Mozart's father took basically an extended leave of absence from his job as court composer to the Archbishop of Salzburg, and took his young son out on tour, and they would just go from one city to the next and basically seek out the richest people in whatever town that they were going to and play little house concerts, give performances. And this was the most successful concert tour in history up to that time. And through this constant touring, Mozart was, first of all, obviously became famous, but also he was probably one of the best traveled people in the world at that time, certainly in Europe, at a time when travel was difficult, was very time-consuming. You have horse-drawn coaches going over muddy roads that if you could make 20 miles a day, that was like some serious traveling. Well, in traveling all over Europe this way, Mozart was exposed to all of the different musical styles and all the greatest musicians in all these different towns, including, for example, he got to meet another one of J.S. Bach's sons, the composer Johann Christian Bach. When Mozart traveled to England, Bach's son, Johann Christian, was living and working in England at that time, and got to know Mozart and actually had him appear on one of his concerts. And I think Mozart was maybe only about 7 or 8 years old at this time. And J.C. Bach, at this concert, they're both sitting down at a keyboard, and he told his audience, okay, everybody close your eyes. I'm going to play a little something, and then little Wolfgang is going to play something, and you have to guess which one of us is playing. So that gives you an idea of how advanced Mozart was, that he could hold his own against a 40-something-year-old man who was one of the greatest musicians of his time. Okay, so Mozart had this fantastic career as a child prodigy, and people oohed and awed over the things that he could do. And unfortunately, that all has to come to an end at some time. And when he was about 15 or 16, the idea was, well, your child prodigy days are over. It's time to get you a steady job. After all, you're not a child wonder anymore. You're grown up, and although you're still a wonder, it's different when you're a child wonder than people are. You know, when you're just an ordinary grown up genius, somehow it doesn't have quite the same fascination maybe for people. So Mozart had to settle down and get some kind of a regular job, and his father wanted him to get some kind of a court composer job, sort of like what he himself had. For the time being, Mozart worked for this same Archbishop Prince that his father worked for. He was given the position as concertmaster of the court orchestra. The concertmaster is the lead violinist. So yeah, by the way, Mozart could play the violin as well as the keyboard. So that's the position that Mozart had in his teens and early 20s. And he also composed, obviously, in this position. But he had a really hard time dealing with his boss, the Archbishop, and the circumstances that he worked in. Because unlike Haydn, now remember, Haydn is coming from nowhere, and is a naturally very sort of a humble person, and felt very grateful to have that kind of a position. Mozart had been a superstar, a child prodigy, and now he's being treated like a servant, and actually being treated in sort of treated in a kind of a degrading way very often by this Prince Archbishop, who was apparently not a very nice man. On one particular occasion, it just so happened that the Prince Archbishop was traveling with his entourage, as they did back then. So he was traveling with his staff, including his court composer, Mozart. And they had traveled from Salzburg to Vienna. And while he was in Vienna, Mozart had an idea. He said, look, if I play a few concerts on the side while I'm here, just private house concerts for people I know in Vienna, I can make as much money in 1 or 2 nights as I could make all year working for the Archbishop. So while I'm here in Vienna, I'll sneak out a couple times and play some of these house concerts and make some money. He did this. He was not supposed to do this, but he did. And the Archbishop found out about it, and this was sort of the last straw. He fired Mozart. He had him physically kicked out of his presence, literally kicked out of the place that they were staying. And Mozart was out on the street, out of a job. Mozart thought, well, you know what, that was kind of embarrassing, but that's okay. I hated that guy anyway. I didn't want to work for that guy. I want to set up my own business, basically become a freelance composer. I will compose the music myself, arrange the concerts myself, and perform myself as a pianist. I'll write my own operas. I'll rent out the opera house, hire the musicians, print the, do all that kind of work, and maybe give some lessons on the side. I'll go into business for myself as a freelance musician. And here I am in Vienna, after all, so I can set up shop that way. So this is what Mozart did, and this is how he spent the last 10 years of his life, his short life. From about age 25 to about age 35, that is from 1781, when he was fired by the Archbishop, until 1791, Mozart attempted to forge a freelance career for himself. And basically, over those 10 years, he had 5 good years and 5 not so good years, unfortunately. And ever since that time, people have speculated or wondered why Mozart's career kind of trailed off in the last 5 years of his life. Having been so popular as a child and quite popular in those first 5 years of his freelance career, why did things go bad for him the last 5 years? In other words, why did he start having a hard time attracting audiences, or getting, for example, if you put on a performance of an opera, if people are not showing up as much on the 3rd night or the 4th night or whatever, the opera house will close it down and bring in something else that's going to make money. They're not going to keep running this opera if it's only half full every night. So usually when you read about this, you say, well, the answer that's given is that the Viennese public were notoriously fickle. That is, fashions changed very quickly in Vienna, and someone who was hot one day was not the next. And there's certainly got to be some truth to that. It's also probably true that another thing you read about Mozart is that he could come across as pretty arrogant, and he rubbed people the wrong way. There was probably a lot of jealousy, first of all, towards him on the part of other musicians who knew of him and his reputation. And Mozart was kind of outspoken. He often gave his opinions about his colleagues, and sometimes not very flattering. About the only other composer that he really admired and respected was Haydn, actually. The two of them were actually pretty close. And Mozart looked at Haydn as sort of a mentor figure, as sort of a father figure, and called him Papa Haydn. Haydn, in turn, also greatly respected Mozart and recognized Mozart and made it plain to people that he considered Mozart the greatest composer who ever lived. And again, remember, Haydn is 30 years older than Mozart. 24 years older than Mozart. And so this is a major compliment for an older, established composer to say that this younger guy is the greatest musician known to me. That's what Haydn said about Mozart. So the two of them admired and respected each other a great deal. But a lot of other musicians, Mozart rubbed the wrong way. And of course, the music business involves a lot of collaboration and making connections. And if you rub people the wrong way, no matter how talented you are, you're going to have a harder time of it. And people often said of Mozart, he would have done much better if he had had half as much talent, but twice as much tact. Now, another problem with Mozart is that as tremendously gifted as he was as a composer, he was not so gifted at the sort of business side, which you need to be if you're going to be a freelance composer. For example, he often procrastinated writing things out. Mozart could compose complete works in his mind without ever having to really write anything down. The music was complete. It was kind of effortless. It's almost as if he had like an iPod or something built into his head with music constantly just sort of self-generating. And all he had to do really was find time to write it down. But the writing was such an arduous task, he often procrastinated. And he was also very bad at managing his money. When he started becoming successful, he would move into a larger apartment and throw parties and just waste money on all kinds of things. Just not very good at managing his own finances. Toward the end of his life, he had to constantly borrow money from people to pay off his creditors, borrowing money from this person to pay off that person that he borrowed from years before. And all the time in those last 5 years, his income was kind of dwindling as he was just not as popular anymore. By the time Mozart died, unfortunately, he was broke. He was beyond broke. He was deeply in debt. And he was kind of forgotten by the Viennese public, and only in the decades after his death did he come to be reappreciated again. Now, Beethoven, the youngest of these three, born in 1770, died in 1827. Like Mozart, Beethoven was born into a musical family. He was born in the town of Bonn, which is in northwestern Germany, where his father was a court musician, was a singer, working for a prince. And unfortunately, Beethoven's father was kind of an alcoholic. Well, not kind of an alcoholic. He was an alcoholic. He was an abusive father. And when he saw that his oldest son, Ludwig, the oldest of three boys, when he saw that his son had musical talent, his first idea was, well, I'm going to exploit this kid just the way that Mozart's father did. I'm going to turn him into the greatest child prodigy ever, and I'm going to take him out on tour and make lots of money. Didn't exactly work out that way. Beethoven was certainly very talented and very advanced. He was not a phenomenal child prodigy like in his single-digit years the way that Mozart had been. But Beethoven's father would often, there are stories of him coming back from the bar with his buddies at 3 o'clock in the morning, dead drunk, waking up little Ludwig and forcing him to practice the piano for hours and hours and hours a day. Now, as Beethoven's father's health deteriorated, Beethoven actually became sort of the breadwinner. He had to go to court at age 16 to have himself made the head of the household, so that the income would go directly to him and not to his father, who was likely to spend it all on booze. And Beethoven also really became essentially a kind of a parent figure for his two younger brothers. Beethoven's mother was often very ill, and in fact she died when he was in his late teens. Beethoven had originally intended to go to Vienna and study with Mozart. That was his dream. And apparently he did, when he was about 17 years old, he did make a trip to Vienna and apparently did have one session with Mozart and played a bit for Mozart. And Mozart apparently was not all that impressed with Beethoven until he asked Beethoven to improvise something, just to make something up without sheet music in front of him. And apparently that impressed Mozart, Beethoven's ability to improvise. Anyway, unfortunately, Beethoven could not stay in Vienna. He received word that his mother was ill and he had to go back up north to Germany. But he was determined to return someday and complete his studies with Mozart. Unfortunately, by the time his parents had died and he was free to do this, and this would have been around 1792 or so, Mozart had died. Mozart died in 1791, and so now what's Beethoven going to do? He cannot study with Mozart anymore. But he might be able to study with Haydn, because Haydn had just retired from his long-standing position as court composer the Esterházy family, and Haydn had settled in Vienna, and so Beethoven was given a sort of a scholarship to go down to Vienna and study with Hyden, which he did for a while. He apparently these sessions with Hyden didn't go so well. Beethoven was very headstrong, arrogant, and would do things behind Haydn's back that Haydn wouldn't have approved of. And Beethoven was just a difficult character, really, all his life. But people put up with it, people who loved music, because they recognized his tremendous ability, and there was something about his music that, even though his personality could be so difficult, people were willing to overlook it. Also, Beethoven was a fantastic pianist. He played like no one had ever seen before, played with extreme passion, and was known to often break pianos, sort of like a rock star of his day, I guess. So when he moved to Vienna, he was immediately recognized as a great pianist, and little by little began to establish himself as a composer as well. Now, I mentioned in an earlier lecture on Beethoven that all of his music is divided, and his career is divided into three periods: an early, middle, and late. Right? The early period of Beethoven's career is basically the first 10 years of his professional adult life in Vienna, from around 1792 or so to around 1802, 1803. And in this period, he is obviously studying and assimilating and mastering the existing style of Haydn and Mozart, which he knew very well. After all, he studied with Haydn, but he knew the music of Haydn and Mozart very, very well. Of course, he's not just imitating. He is kind of making this style his own, and you can definitely tell, more of a difference from, let's say, early Beethoven it's easier to tell Beethoven from the other two. Often, if you are not that experienced, let's say, and you hear something from this era being performed on the radio or whatever, it might be harder to tell whether it's Haydn or Mozart, but you will definitely be able to tell Beethoven. Beethoven has his own distinct personality even from the very beginning. So, for example, that piano sonata that we listened to in a previous lecture, that's an example of early period Beethoven. The middle period begins around 1802, 1803, and this period is where probably his best known works, like the Fifth Symphony, those are his middle period works. What's different about the middle period? Well, what really kind of triggers the middle period, I think most scholars agree, is that this is when Beethoven's deafness begins to manifest itself. Beginning around 1800, the first signs of this deafness begin to appear. And apparently the problem with Beethoven's hearing was not really his ears, it was his auditory nerve, the nerve that leads from the ears to the brain, which there have been various explanations for what caused this nerve to deteriorate. It may have been syphilis, for example, or it may have been the treatment for syphilis, which in those days involved heavy metals like mercury and lead, which is bad for you. Don't mess around with mercury or lead. But of course, medicine in the 18th century or in the early 19th century, doctors didn't really know what they were doing for the most part. But whatever the reason, Beethoven's auditory nerve began to degrade, and his hearing, it's not like he went deaf suddenly. It took a long time, and it was sort of an agonizing process with a lot of ups and downs. And Beethoven would seek out cures. He would go to various doctors who would make various prescriptions that, of course, didn't really do anything. But what this had the effect of doing is sort of giving Beethoven hope, and then being disappointed, and having hope again, and being disappointed again. And it also had the effect of making him kind of withdraw from society because it obviously didn't want people to know that he was going deaf. That wouldn't be very good for his reputation as a musician. So his solution to this was to kind of withdraw and become isolated. And this made him probably even more eccentric than he already was. He had always been kind of an eccentric, difficult person, but probably even more so once he started going deaf. And Beethoven himself more or less admitted that he was kind of suicidal during this period because obviously everything, music is what he lived for. And here he is at the top of at the sort of the peak of his career, and the one thing, that is indispensable in a composer begins to go. Now, people sometimes wonder, well, how is it that he was able to compose as he was losing his hearing? For someone with that level of training, you don't actually need to hear the music to know what it sounds like, right? You could look at a score, you could compose music and know what it sounds like without actually physically hearing it. Right? But nonetheless, it still affects you as a musician because musicians, they live for sounds, not just music, but natural sounds too. Beethoven, for example, loved to take long walks out in the country. This is where he did a lot of his best composing, coming up with musical ideas. And he loved to walk out in the country and hear the birds singing and this kind of thing. And all that was now fading away. And so he underwent a definite personal crisis because of this deafness. And at one point admitted in a letter that he intended to send to his brothers but never did, that he had contemplated suicide. But the one thing that held him back is that he still felt that he had more to say. That he had more music inside of him that he wanted to get out. So the only thing he had to live for anymore was composing. So he continued to compose. The middle period works, and the book goes into, by the way, the style periods of Beethoven and talks about the differences here on page 198. But just to give a very brief characterization of the middle period works, they are characterized by a sense of struggle, of the struggle of Beethoven's existence, I guess, at this point, which is expressed through his music. There are often violent clashes and conflicts and a great deal of tension, vivid contrasts of loud and soft, of slow and fast, etc., etc. And in our next lecture, our final lecture for this unit, we will listen to the Fifth Symphony, and you will hear exactly these characteristics. The late period of Beethoven's career is basically the period when his deafness is total, and this is from about maybe about the last dozen years of his life or so, from about 1815 to 1827. And here Beethoven was completely deaf. And I think it's probably the case that if he had not been deaf, the music wouldn't have turned out that way. Even though he knew, again, as I said before, he knew what this music sounded like. But I think composing out of this silent world that he was now living in must have had an effect on the kind of music that he composed. In his own time, the late works of Beethoven were not very well understood or appreciated. A lot of people thought that, well, he's just kind of lost it. I mean, he's always been kind of strange and eccentric, and now he's deaf, and a lot of people just didn't get those later works of Beethoven. And Beethoven himself understood this, and he said things like, well, this music I'm writing now is not for this time. It's for the future. It's for some future time. And indeed, today, most people agree that the later period, late Beethoven, is the greatest of his three periods. The late works are the greatest works by Beethoven. They are the most experimental, for one thing. Beethoven is taking great liberties with these forms I've talked about that I had on the handout. So, for example, Very often we find works that don't just have the usual 3 or 4 movements, maybe sometimes 2 movements, or 5 or 6 movements. Right? The movement forms that we talked about, like sonata form, whatever, rondo form, are often very either greatly compressed or greatly expanded. There's a lot of experimentation with older genres. So Beethoven, during his late period, was studying the works of Bach very closely and started composing a lot of types of pieces that we associate more with the Baroque style, with the late Baroque style of J.S. Bach. For example, fugues. A lot of fugues in late Beethoven. A lot of works that are in theme and variation form. So Beethoven seems to have taken a real strong interest in late Baroque era music and kind of worked it into his late style. And as I said, it's just a very experimental period. And maybe the greatest example of this is the famous Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, his last symphony, which includes a chorus and 4 vocal soloists. So remember, a symphony is supposed to be a purely instrumental work for orchestra. Well, Beethoven decided he wanted to have a chorus, he wanted to have singers, and he wanted to have vocal soloists in addition to the chorus. So this is the famous choral symphony, the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, which is a vast, huge, long symphony. It's well over an hour long. It's another thing about Beethoven. Beginning in his middle period, very often his works are just much larger and longer than had been the case for, let's say, a typical Haydn or a Mozart symphony. A Beethoven symphony might be twice as long as a typical Haydn or Mozart symphony. Interesting contrast between Beethoven and Mozart. Remember I said that Mozart composed pretty much effortlessly, and the music just kind of spontaneously generated itself in his mind, and Mozart simply had to find time to write it down. And he could be composing multiple works simultaneously, completely in his head. And when you look at the handwritten drafts of Mozart's compositions, you see very, very few like scratch outs or corrections, or because it was already done in his head, and again, he just had to write it down. And for that reason, Mozart was very, very prolific. He composed an awful lot of music in his short time on this earth. 35 years, he composed well over 600 major works. Beethoven composed in really the opposite way. He was much slower, and he revised things over time. He would come up with a theme first, just a theme, or maybe even just sort of a motive that he would turn into a theme, and then that theme might be revised many times, and then the rest of the composition would take shape around those themes. And he actually kept notebooks, and he saved these notebooks so that we can see the development of many of his works. That is, as long as you can understand Beethoven's handwriting, which is terribly messy and difficult to understand. But if people who are experts at this, who have studied Beethoven's handwriting, can look through his sketchbooks and trace the development of his works in the same way that, for example, you can look at the development of a fetus and an embryo and see the animal take shape finally at the end of this process. Something kind of similar can be done with Beethoven's works. Another interesting thing, by the way, speaking of stuff writing down, when Beethoven was completely deaf, and in his last, let's say, dozen years or so, if you wanted to talk to Beethoven, what you would do is you would write. So he would keep a notebook with him, and you would write something down, and then he would answer you verbally, because he could still speak. It's just that he couldn't hear anymore. So in addition to his musical sketchbooks, we have these conversation books by Beethoven. Unfortunately, they only record half of the conversation. We know what questions or what things people said to Beethoven, but we don't know the answers, because he didn't write down the answers. He gave the answers verbally. But nonetheless, these conversation books were also preserved, many of them. Another difference, by the way, with Mozart, when Beethoven died, Beethoven was really the first thoroughly successful freelance composer. That is, he never in his adult life had a court composer job where he had to wear a uniform and report for work and compose in a style to please a particular boss. So he was freelance his entire adult life, let's say from about age 22 or so till the time he died at age 57. And at the end of his career, he was financially set. He was pretty well off. His music was still loved. Thousands of people came to his funeral. So he achieved that kind of worldly success and fame that unfortunately Mozart did not in his own lifetime. And Beethoven was really kind of like one of these, definitely a product of his time, an enlightened man, a guy who would not take any crap, even from the nobility, right? Who believed the kinds of things, let's say, that you might read in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, or they should be equal. And now he was a very difficult person to deal with personally. He's kind of like one of these people who loved mankind in the abstract, but was often very nasty toward actual fellow human beings. Had all kinds of problems with for example, with his brothers and with one sister-in-law in particular that he didn't like. He had difficult relationships with people very often. And he was treated as kind of an equal by the nobility. This is something different. This is something that Haydn and Mozart unfortunately didn't. They didn't get this kind of treatment because times, of course, were changing. For one thing, and remember I said this period, the Enlightenment, is a period of tremendous social change. So, for example, the aristocracy were not were careful as time went on to not agitate the lower classes, right? And so they were more likely to treat, let's say, especially artistic, creative people, even if they were not members of the nobility, to treat them more humanely, at least, if not as equals. Some of them probably misunderstood also Beethoven's name. The Van, if Beethoven had been of German ancestry, the Von, V-O-N, in a German name signals that you are a member of the nobility. The nobility all have that Von. That's how you know someone is of that noble class. Beethoven was a Van, which doesn't mean anything in particular. Beethoven was actually of Dutch ancestry, and the Van for a Dutch person does not mean that you are of the nobility, the same way that Von does in Germany. But a lot of people probably didn't really realize that and assumed that Beethoven was of the nobility. And he definitely took advantage of this sometimes. He was kind of a tricky guy in some ways, kind of a sneaky guy. Anyway, I can see that my phone battery is running out, so I'm going to have to bring this lecture to a close. And unfortunately, I've just scratched the surface of these three composers. But the kind of stuff I would ask about them on the test can be found in those biographical sections in the book. So I urge you to reread those and also reread that section on the composer, the patron, and the public. The social history behind the music. Our next lecture and the final lecture of this unit will be just a sort of a listening overview of the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven. So we'll see you then.